What's up, everybody? Alex here. Hope everybody's having a good summer. So in this video, I'm going to talk about constructors and access modifiers. I'm going to get to the nitty gritty of that. So let's get right to it. So as we're looking at this example here on my screen, you're going to see that I created a student class and I have one instance variable. Now, in most classes that you create, you're either going to have a predetermined constructor, or you can actually create the constructor yourself. And the constructor is basically a method that allows you to initialize an instance of the class. For example, if I start typing here, I could say public and then the class name, student. And this is what we call a parameterless constructor. Okay, so the name itself should give you a clue as to what the job of it is. It's basically to construct the object. Now I say that you have the option, right? You don't have to have a constructor in your class unless you see a need for it in terms of initializing other variables. So, let me give you an example here. So what I could do is that whenever somebody instantiates my student class, I can initialize first name to null. Okay, actually let's do empty string. Okay. So what that's going to do is it's actually going to, whenever I instantiate an object of the class student, it's going to allow me to, it's going to actually automatically going to set first name to null. So let's take a look at an example here in main. So if I do the following, I'll do student stu equals new student. Okay, now right now my student class doesn't do anything, but as soon as I do this instantiation by using the word new, this is actually making a call to the student constructor that I've created. So if you look at over here, this is my constructor. It's going to come in here and then initialize first name to empty string. Now, to prove to you that it does work, then I can also, and this is not something that you should do, but I could also just say system.out.println an instance of student was created, right? So when somebody initializes my creates an object of student, it's going to initialize first name to empty string, and then it's also going to print this message out for whatever reason. Now I'm just giving it as an example, but you should never put in any system.out.println statements inside your constructor. So let's do that. Let's run that. Let's see what happens. So as you see on the right hand side, you see that an instance of a student was created. So this message is coming from my student constructor. Okay, so a couple of rules for the constructor. The constructor has to have the same name as a class. So as you know, I created my constructor called student, and the name of my class is student. So that's the first thing. The second rule is thou shalt not put any type of return for the constructor. So the constructor itself is not going to return any value, not even void. Okay, so you should never put a public void student in your constructor. It has no return type. Okay, it's only used to instantiate your object, but it should never be used as a return type or something where you're just looking for a value. Okay, and then the third rule is, and it's not a do not, it's actually, you can do something called overloading constructor, and I'll talk about that in the next lecture as to what overloading is. Overloading is a concept in object-oriented programming, and we're getting into polymorphism at that point. Okay, great. So now we know what a constructor is. We're allowed to create one in our class. All well and good. Okay. Now let's talk about access modifiers and what we use them for, and what is all this public and private stuff. So let's take a look. So this class actually gives you a good mix of some access modifiers that we can go over. And that's what we're going to do now. So here we have private, right? So when you have anything marked as private, then only code inside this class can access the variable or the object you're trying to declare. So in this particular case, this variable here, first name, can only be accessed inside my student class. And you see that I did it here, right? I was able to access it inside the constructor. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. But if I try to access this outside the student class, then that would give me a problem. So for example, if I said, let's do student stu is equal to new, and then student. All I'm doing here is creating an instance of the object. And then if I try to do stu dot first name, and this will throw out an error. And let's just pretend we're in the main, right? So public class main. So I cannot do this because first name is private. Again, I'm trying to access the first name variable, the instance variable inside main, right? And I instantiated the object of student, right? Now, when I instantiate the object, I'm basically saying that now inside main, I want to use student, right? And for me to actually use student, I have to do a new student, right? So this line here, this code here will instantiate an object. By doing that, it's encapsulating first name because first name is private. So I cannot do that. So that's why if I'm going to expose first name, what I want to do is I would want to create another method inside student and make it public. So if you decide to declare things private, just know that anything inside the class where it's declared in is okay. You can access it. But anybody that tries to come out from the outside and access that specific instance variable or method or object, they're not going to be able to. Okay? So let me give you another example here. So let's say I have this class called main.java, right? So you've seen that before, right? When we run our programs. Inside main.java, think of it as a box. And inside here, what we want to do is we want to access student because maybe we want to grab a method from student, right? Right now there's no methods, but let's just assume that there is a method that we want to call, or we just want to have a reference to it. Okay, great. So if we create an object of student, think of it as an inner box inside main, right? Where you have an instance of the student class as an actual tangible object. Now, when you have that instance, okay, the only things that are available to main, okay, are anything that is public. So in this case, obviously the constructor, right? So I'll type in constructor. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so the only thing available to us from main when we have an instance of this object is the constructor. Anything else, because it's private, is not accessible to us from main. Okay, now let's say that I created another method here. Okay, let's create another method and we'll call it something public. So now we have this method to the left, right, over here. This is public now. So if I'm inside main, I have an instance of student, right? I can access the constructor because I can instantiate it, which I did. And then I also have the method accessible to me, get first name. So what that means is that inside main, if in terms of code, okay, so let's look at code. If I'm inside main, I can instantiate the object, right? So student stu equals new student. Okay, sorry for the handwriting, but you get the point, right? So here I'm instantiating the object. And then now if I say stu dot get first name, that's allowed, right? Because get first name is public. And even though I'm not inside the student class, just because it is marked as public, then I can call that method, and I would get no encapsulation errors. Okay, and you're gonna see that in other classes that you'll use, where there are some private methods, private variables that you won't have access to, but then you have the public methods and variables that you could potentially have access to. Now, that brings me to another concept of application or real world, right? So if you're encapsulating first name, how do you set it? How do you set it? Well, what you need to do is create another method to set the value. So let's do that real quick. So as we look at this class, and it's growing now, right? So the student class is growing. If I want to set my first name, now I have a method that I can call. And the only condition here is that when I do call that method, I have to pass in a value. So if I say stu set first name, I would pass in some type of string, I don't know, John, right? And what that's going to do is, again, the set first name is public. So it comes in here, it passes in John, right? Because that's what we're passing in. And then it's going to set the value to my first name. So now, at this point in the game, my first name variable, instance variable, is John. Now, I didn't have to touch the property itself, right? I created methods to expose. One is to get the value, and the other one is to set the value. And that's how usually you should expose instance variables in a class. Okay? So one important point about the access modifiers, right, public, private, so far, that we've learned, is that you can't declare your class as private. Okay, so if I did private class student, then nobody can really access it. So you should not do that. But let's say that you perhaps maybe only want to instantiate it once. Okay, so that's the concept of a singleton. We'll get to that point. But another way that you maybe only want one person or one class to instantiate your object or your class is to make the constructor private. You can do that. So if I made this over here, instead of a public student constructor, I can make it private student. I can do that. Okay, but on definition, this has to be public. Okay, or you could also make it protected, and we'll go into that in a little bit. Sorry, I meant protected variables, not classes. You cannot have a protected class. Okay. So let me show you a chart that I got from tutorials.genkov.com they provide a good summary of what you can do with the access modifiers. Okay, so here is a good chart of access modifiers and what you can do and what you can't do. So I'll show you how to read this. So if you look on the left, this is the what in terms of what type of class that you can do. So in a class, right, when you create a class, you cannot make the class private. So you see that private is no, right? You can make a class default. You cannot make a class protected, and you can make it public. And pretty much everything for public, you're allowed to do class, nested class. Nested class will go into it this semester. Constructor, you can make it public. A method, you can make it public, and a field, you can make it public. So pretty much anything you can make public using the access modifier public. Okay. What you can't do is you can't make a class protected. You can't do that. So that's what it says no. And then for the nested class, you can make that protected. You can make a constructor protected, a method protected, and any field protected. And that's okay. And then default, again, I'm not going to cover that right now. We'll get into that later. And then private, like I said, you cannot make a class private, but you could make a nested class private. And you can have a constructor that's private, a method that's private, and a field that's private. Most of the time, okay, we're going to stick to this area here and this area here. This I will talk about in a little bit as well in terms of protected, but we're not going to be using that too much, okay? That gets into more advanced concepts in Java with packages, okay? But I'm going to talk about it in the next video as to what does it mean to be protected, okay? So I want to leave you with one final problem, and maybe you can work on it until the next video. Okay, so let's say you have three classes. You have dog, you have cat, and then you have animal. Okay, and animal instantiates an object of dog and instantiates an object of cat. Does animal have access to dog's private members? And does animal have access to cat's private members? Okay, and then that's one question. The other question is, now cat is now creating an instance of the animal class. So we created an animal object here. Now that we created an animal object, can we access the public methods in animal? Okay, can we access the public methods in animal? And then dog created an instance of cat, and are we allowed to access the private methods of cat? Are we allowed to access the private methods of cat? So think about that, and then I'll come up with the answer on the next video.